I am from Robots and Pencils. I'm actually the CTO at Robots and Pencils, and we're an agency. We also build products. One of those products is called Beep Boop, which is a developer platform for building and deploying Slack integrations. But today we're going to talk about developer experience. And so when we consider developer relations, and we talk about the purpose of developer relations, and we've heard about this today, like the functions of developer relations, pushing back, influencing the platform and product, as well as pushing out to developers and working with the developer community. I borrowed this from Redo Meyer, one of his blog posts. He's a dev advocate for Google Android team. But basically, if you look at this graph, the interface into the virtuous cycle, right, which is that developers build better apps that lead to better user experience, lead to more successful apps, and a more successful ecosystem that then feed into better apps. The way then to fuel that is to just pour more and more fuel onto building better developer experience. And I really think that's the job, for the most part, of developer relations, at least as it pertains to making developers successful. And I think, at least in my mind, and my full-time role isn't DevRel, which is kind of interesting. But when I look at DevRel, especially as a developer, and having almost 20 years experience as a developer, I would say that developer relations program should be measured by developer success. And when we talk about developer success and what makes them successful, it's very similar to user experience. And so Don Norman, who's sort of one of the founders, he was actually the first person who had user experience in his title when he was at Apple in the 90s. And what he said of user experience was that it encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. So much broader than a lot of times what we come to think about user experience as. When we say you're a user experience designer, a lot of times that means that you design user interfaces. But it's much broader than that. And so I didn't have another picture to put here, but to the template. So I guess I said this. I don't know. I just replaced some of his words. But basically, I would say that developer experience encompasses all aspects of the developer's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. And so a lot of times we think of DevRel, and we put developers sort of in a box, and we think of them only in relationship to our API docs or our APIs, but it really encompasses everything, including your product, not just the platform. When we think about what is the developer's experience, what's the relationship with that product. And so I think we could borrow some tools from user experience research to sort of help shape our DevRel strategy. And one of those is personas. This was mentioned in the last talk of basically, don't just assume that your developer is one thing, right? Developers are diverse. They could be academic in school, they could be hobbyists, they could be at large enterprises, at startups. Identify and design personas around what developers you're targeting and in ways that describe and personify them to better understand who your target audience even is. In addition to that, there's a thing called journey maps, which basically tracks major life cycles through your product. This could be sign up. This could be getting through your first getting started guide. But basically what you're doing is you're tracking throughout that process how the developer feels. Are they happy and delighted, or are they angry and anxious and displeased? And so this helps you kind of visualize some of the key journeys in your product. And then third is really just watch, ask, listen, right? Talk to your developers. Actually, listen to what they say. And I'll show you some ways to do that. And number one is just care about how your developers feel. Because how they feel is really what their developer experience is. And a lot of times we don't really empathize as much with developers. We empathize with users, and we talk about that a lot. But I think there's a big lack of empathy, right? The irony of the Amazon Alexa example is Amazon is the one that says, we are the customer service company, right? That's their goal and their mantra. But what we hear today is that it's not that simple. And I think, though you can say those words, I think they could do better. So how do we measure how developers feel? I'd like to share with you a perspective from Professor Noriyako Kano, who in the 1980s in Japan, he was really looking at quality and the impact that quality had on customer satisfaction, and basically said that he didn't find a linear relation between quality and customer satisfaction, and that If you make a product better, it doesn't necessarily mean the customer is going to be more satisfied. Makes sense, right? And so he developed this model. I think it's a model that we could use for a lot of things. It's used in user experience design, and I think it can certainly be used in developing our strategy around developer relations and developer tooling, API docs, developer support, all those things. And so let's just walk through this. So basically, there's two axes here, two-dimensional. This horizontal axis is quality. So this is basically if it's nothing, garbage, crap, or not done at all the way towards done sort of to perfection and completion with a high amount of investment. And then on the y-axis, all the way down here is sort of your most area of despair and disgust as a developer or as a user. And all the way up here is delight, like full, complete, elated delight, right? And then so what we can do is look at several categories that the Kano model describes to help us think about certain features, certain services. And the first one is called baseline expectations. And so these are the things that if you look at a category of products, you would say, the product must have this. Or actually your users or your developers would say, it must have this. However, there's something interesting about this category. Like if you look at over here, so if you basically invest poorly or don't do it at all, people are extremely unhappy. But the more you invest in it, you get to this point where they're happy enough. They're basically, content. But no matter what you can do, you can never make them happy. They'll never be delighted that that exists. So API documentation, for example, and I mean Stripe, everybody's uses as the example. It's great, and I think people appreciate that. And we say that, especially we appreciate it, right, as developers and as a DevRel community. However, most people won't say I love Stripe because of the documentation. They say Stripe. They love Stripe because of the actual experience of using the product and how easy it is and how easy it is to collect payments. If the payments bit was horrible and the documentation was great, you'd think that they were upside down completely. In addition, if there's no documentation or it's just complete rubbish, then people will be very unhappy. So these are the things that you have to gauge. You have to do them, they're expected, but you have to be careful how many resources you pour into them because you get marginal returns in the long run. The second category are called linear satisfiers, or sometimes they call these performance. And basically what these are is the more you put in, the more you get out of it. So the more you invest in it, the more satisfaction you get out of it. And this, people usually use price as an example, or let's say even credits, like free developer credits. So the more you give developers free credits, the more they use and the happier they are, right? These are things that are very linear. And the third category are delighters. And so these are the things that if you survey your users and ask them what they want of a product, or let's say your developer experience, they usually would never think of typically, right? They would usually not request this thing, but when they get it, they're delighted. They're happy, they're amazed, they're pleasantly surprised, right? And even just by, if you look at where this sits on this graph, even just their existence or almost that you made an attempt makes them happy and delighted. And the more you put that in, makes them very excited and happy to use your product. And so here's an example of that from a sort of developer relations perspective. So who's here familiar with Clearbit? And Alex McCaw? Okay. So Clearbit, they offer an API for like company data. Really interesting. But so I signed up for their API. And I got this email from Alex, and I knew of him at least. And this is just a form email that goes out to anybody that signs up for their program. But it's, he's the founder and CEO, but he says, I'm a developer, and founder at Clearbit, and I just want to say hi. And basically, if you're local, let's go grab coffee, or we could pair together. And that's the thing that really stood out for me. So he's like totally making himself available. I didn't take him up on this. Right? But I've shared this over and over and over again. That's the delighters of those kinds of things. That when people are delighted with your product, those are the things they tend to share with people. And I've had a positive sort of view of Clearbit, even though I've barely even used the API. But if I need an API for that type of thing, I'll go back to it. But so perfect example of a delighter. There's another sort of category of product that's called indifference. And these are the things that you really want to stay away from. So what this basically is, that no matter what you do, whether you do it or not, or you do it to the best of its ability, people just don't care. They don't care enough to be dissatisfied, and they don't care enough to be satisfied, right? And you'd be surprised how many of these things we do on a day-to-day basis, right? If your intent is to drive developer satisfaction and emphasize how they feel, look at the things that you do on a day-to-day basis and how you actually impact developers, and I guarantee you'll find things that have nothing to do with how they feel, and they wouldn't really care one way or another whether you do that. And so if we look at all these together, it gives us this model for sort of categorizing different features and where we should focus. And again, the important thing to mention here is with baseline expectations, these are the things that you have to do in your product. If you don't, all these other things don't matter. But the key thing is you don't have to do them extremely well, you just have to do them. And so the Kano motto is really a framework for prioritizing developer satisfaction and delight. And so Andy Piper was here. Might he be here? I don't know. There he is, Andy. This is basically my story of my perception of Twitter. As someone who started using Twitter in 2007 and sort of went through the cycle of what Andy described. And don't get me wrong, I love Twitter. I love developing for Twitter. But I want to just describe basically having empathy for a developer, and this is my perspective, sort of what this looks like. And so Twitter launched their API in November of 2006, about 6 months after sort of the first tweet. It was very early on. Even at that point, the sort of ecosystem of Twitter was exploding. It was amazing. It was really the first social API ever at the time, where you had just a massive amount of data from all over the world, all sorts of people that you weren't even connected to, and that you had geolocation information, you had lots of interesting intersections of data, and it just exploded. So all these apps up here you see were created by the developer community. It's like it's the thing everybody wants, right? You open up this API, even before they opened the API and people were scraping their web API, it just exploded. Like, awesome, successful story with Twitter. But then, Twitter got to a point where, trying to, really needed to be able to, monetize the product and needed to be able to control the user experience more. And this is kind of how I think of it, is like, you have this amazing, powerful thing that you kind of lost control of. And then you've got to figure out, well, now, what do I do? And so along came some of those reactions. There was OAuthCalypse. That's a really hard thing to say. You should all try to say that. Which was, the restriction of authentication. In the beginning, you barely had to authenticate for anything, and then when you did, you used basic auth, and it was basically wide open. It just threw open the doors in the beginning and gave everybody access to it, and just saw what they did, and they did amazing things. Then there was what I call the Clone Wars. Here's my Star Wars reference, which was basically the battle of Twitter battling people that competed with the core features of its product and trying to diminish those. And then there was just lots of sort of angst around the developer community as Twitter kept removing sort of these features that people expected. That's kind of the key thing there. And then, as Andy described at Flight, I think this was 2014, and we'll share the same slide, they announced all these developer tools geared at mobile developers. And the reaction was sort of one of consternation from the developer community at the time. Which is, if you're familiar with the sort of Peanuts scene here, which every time Charlie Brown tries to kick the ball, Lucy pulls it away, right? And then tries to convince him to do it again, So it's like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me once, fool me twice, shame on me. And so all the way to the point in, I think it was 2015, when Jack Dorsey took over again as CEO and stood up and basically apologized to the developer community and said, we're going to reboot the whole thing. We're sorry. We're sorry that and this was like they owned it, right? We're sorry we created the confusion. We want to make sure that we are learning, listening, and then we're going to reboot the community. And it's awesome to kind of see that. But it's like any relationship kind of takes time to heal. And so if we sort of plot out this journey map, and this again is like my Twitter developer journey as someone that developed for Twitter very early on, this is how I felt about it. Early on, it was amazing. Even before there was no API, people were doing things with it. They were scraping the web API. And then when they launched the API, it just blew up. You had the first iPhone app for Twitter, mobile app, wasn't by Twitter. TweetDeck obviously wasn't by Twitter, even though they acquired them. All these things, the first, social content search wasn't by Twitter. The community exploded. But then, here, after sort of the honeymoon and then apocalypse, I can't say that, and the Clone Wars and then tools for mobile developers, like how I describe this is initially, there was some pain, but then people got over it, right? Because it was just auth. But then once Twitter started to limit your, API usage limitations, terms of services got more strict, it was very sort of discouraging, and there's, again, lots of consternation. And then, but we're kind of back at this point where it's like over time heals all wounds, and you're sort of back level set. And I think it's like the perfect time as this reboot continues for Twitter for them to pick that up. And this isn't a cut on Twitter. This is what people would describe as a good problem to have, right? This happened in the first place. This doesn't happen barely to anybody at that scale. Amazing. And so if I break this down and you look at these two sections, I was delighted as hell up here. So we look at the categories of features Twitter launched. It was like an API of its kind had never been launched with that type of data, right? People were blown away, doing all sorts of things, had nothing but great things to say about Twitter. I think that's what really produced this delight. Down here was actually directly influenced by what happened up here. And this is where I talked about basic expectations. So, and basic expectations are not necessarily things that you expect, it's what developers expect. And sometimes they're in your control and sometimes they're out of your control. In this case, it was very much in Twitter's control. Hindsight being 2020, when they launched this API, threw the doors open and to see what people would do with it, they did amazing things. However, I think what really drove, at least again, this is from my perspective here, what wasn't met is this basic expectation of what I got up here, which was like full unbridled open access to tweet data, right? Which then that got taken away from me. So, and then even as this optimization when flight happened, I was kind of disappointed because even though they launched a whole bunch of new tools that I could get excited about, I feel like my sort of basic core expectations weren't being met. And so it's another interesting thing about how Kano described this model is basically that there's a natural decay of delight into expected features. And so the delighters that you launch today become expected soon after. A perfect example of this is Wi-Fi on an airplane, right? If you ever seen the Louis C.K. video where he talks about that happening much faster. But in general, like when we first had Wi-Fi on an airplane, you were just happy to connect and be like, oh, it's working, and I'm in a plane, But then now you go on a plane and you're just like, this is bullshit, right? Like there's no Wi-Fi, or it doesn't work, or it's slow, and it's not meeting our basic expectations of flight in general. And so really, how do you do this? How do you execute on the Kano model? It's a good thing to look and say, well, that's how you sort of quantify different features or services. But Kano maps out a pretty easy process of actually collecting this information. And what you do is it's a survey, and for each feature that you want to survey on, you ask two questions. How do you feel if you had it? And then how do you feel if you didn't have it? And based on that, you answer with the most positive is I like it, and the most negative is I dislike it, and the middle is I'm neutral. And the others are I expect it to be there, don't necessarily like it, or I can tolerate it but don't necessarily dislike it. And so then with that information, you categorize those features on a chart. And there's some here that are a little bit confusing, like everything here marked reverse is basically someone said, I love it if it was there, I love it if it wasn't there, right? So those are kind of the reverse. And that either tells you that your survey is confusing or that people really don't care. Like they just are like, love it, love it, love it, C on the test, whatever. But for simplicity, we'll remove those. And then indifferent, all these things here, that's basically what we described as those are the things you want to stay away from. People are basically indifferent of whether they're there or not. And so the ones I really care about are these delighters, the linear satisfiers, and baseline. Linear satisfiers are great if you can get them, but again, it's based on how much you pour in is what you get in a linear way, whereas the delighter can be sort of exponential in nature. And again, basic expectations are everything that you need to do. So, with basic expectations, if you actually look over here, and up top this is where you plot out if the feature was absent and someone said, I would dislike that. So if you said API docs, that was my example before. If you ask someone, how would you feel if there were no API docs for the service? And they said, well, I would dislike it. No matter what, I would dislike that. But if you said, how would you feel if there were API docs? And they go, I would expect them to be there. I really don't care. I could live without them. So people answer things differently when you say, like, I could live without it, but it's say, well, what if you didn't have it? They say, I didn't like that. You know, those are the things that are basic expectations, and that's how you look at this. And so just in review, I would encourage you to look at, and when you consider developer experience, think about how developers feel, empathize with them, and then borrow these tools that have been around now for decades for how we measure products and services around how people feel. These things, personas, journey maps, and more specifically like the Kano model, and just designing for delight and satisfaction. That's all I had. So, thank you.